Andrea, let me know when we can get started.
Give me 1 second, please.
Okay, whenever you're ready.
Okay. Okay, I apologize. I am ready anytime you are ready.
No problem, Andrea. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to call the meeting to order. So it is 4:01 p.m. and I will call the City Council study session of Tuesday, September 21st, 2021 to order at 4:01 p.m. City Clerk, can you please call the roll and establish quorum?
Yes. Councilmember Liang.
Here.
Councilmember Meadows.
Here.
Councilmember Weinberg.
Here.
Vice Mayor Neander.
Here.
And Mayor Fliger.
Here.
Thank you. All council members are present.
Wonderful, thank you. Next, we'll have public comments on the only agenda item, and of course, this is a study session. And so members of the public listening in, if you would like to comment on the only study session item we're hearing this afternoon, which is on the Halsey House options, now is your time to speak. And so if you could please raise your virtual hands, the city clerk will call on you. Thank you. And City Clerk, I see 2 hands. Oh, they're going up, 3 hands now. Of course, with the new norms that we adopted at the last meeting, it's no longer automatic that I give everybody 3 minutes if it's less than 10 hands raised, but I will still go ahead and do 3 minutes. So City Clerk, I'll turn it over to you and we can start with the first person.
Okay, our first speaker is Salim, followed by Gary Hedden. Salim.
Hi, yeah. As a kid, I went to Redwood Grove for camp, but like most kids who went to camp, I never felt anything, special about the Halsey House. It's never been a great place, or it's never been what draws people to the camp, or Redwood Grove for that matter. I hope that the city takes the cost-sensitive approach and considers demolishing the house. We could spend, these millions of dollars on our staff. You've heard from the city manager that they've been short-staffed and it's limiting what the city can do. So that seems like a bigger priority in my mind. Thank you.
Thanks, Salim.
Our next speaker is Gary Hedden.
Hello, honored council. This is Gary Hedden, Altos resident. I, of course, want to save the Halsey House, and I'm happy with either the adaptive restoration or the full restoration. I want to remind you that there is a great story here, and that's why this becomes something that's important. We have the Halsey House because of the Halsey family. They planted the redwoods, and that's why we now have the Redwood Grove. And more to the point, we also have another interesting story. In the 1970s, there was a vote by the city to purchase this property. The city residents voted against that, but the city council realized that, well, maybe the residents didn't want to pay the taxes. That's fine, but that doesn't mean it's a bad idea to not want this property saved as a park. So they dipped into the coffers and bought the property. And that's the kind of leadership that we really appreciate 50 years later. Roy Lave led that effort. And so thank you to that city council. And it's a wonderful story there too. I think bringing it back in some way, shape or form, and combining that with the summer camp, because we need to do more things for the kids. We are a family-centered city, and so this is a great opportunity to combine both things. We want to tell the story, save enough of it to sell the story, maybe save all of it. Of course, it's a lot of money. There might be some fundraising needed, but let's do that and combine it with the Parks and Rec program, because that will appeal to a large group of people in this city, I think. And so that would be my recommendation. Do not demolish it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Gary.
Our next speaker is John Baer.
I would encourage the council to pursue option one, which is rehabilitation, or if funding is not currently available, mothballing. After reading the CEQA requirements, my observation is that options 2 and 3, partial or complete demolition, are not feasible options for this council to pursue. The reason for this is that there are other lower cost options which avoid the adverse environmental impacts associated with options 2 and 3. And CEQA requires you to consider other options which avoid impacts, particularly if they are lower in cost than the proposed option. I realize this is a subject that has a lot of people voicing opinions and personal preferences, but this is not a case where you get to pick an option that you either like or do not like. We need to lay aside personal opinions and biases and follow the letter of the law, and CEQA is very clear on this matter. And I would say that while the mayor reminds you and me all the time that I am not an expert on this subject, and I am not, I will tell you I have significant personal experience as to what happened with Griffin House on the Foothill College campus, and the facts in that case are not materially different than the facts in this case. And ultimately that building was required to remain standing, and it has been effectively mothballed. And unfortunately, that reaching that conclusion by the district was a very expensive, long and protracted process, one that I hope the city will avoid. Thank you very much.
Thanks, John.
Our next speaker is Roberta. Roberta, are you able to unmute? There
Can
we
you
go.
hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Oh, hi, everyone. So I know that this is an emotional issue, and I'm really happy that City Council is addressing the top issue, because we all do know it's a top issue. And my main concern is the law, because it is a historic site, and we have a responsibility to follow the law and not get ourselves into other lawsuits. If we need to take a phased approach in doing this because of finances, I'm obviously very financially conservative, as everybody probably knows. But I just want to make sure that you do follow CEQA and you do follow the law. And that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Roberta.
We have, oops, we did have one more speaker. His hand is down now. Oh, here we go. John Great is our next speaker.
Yes, I'd like to take a higher level view of this. The city just spent $38 million on the North Los Altos Community Center and is contemplating further capital investments on the city center Hillview complex. I'd like to see a moratorium on any new capital projects in North Los Altos until some capital projects in South Los Altos have been advanced and budgeted, such as redevelopment of Grant Park and development of 999 Fremont as a community resource. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John.
Madam Mayor, I see no one else with their hand raised.
Great, thank you, Andrea.
You're welcome.
Okay, so we'll move to the next agenda item, which is the discussion item, the Halsey House options. And so I'll turn it over to staff. I don't know who's presenting.
Thank you, Mayor. It will be our Special Projects Manager, Dave Breeze.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much. Good afternoon, Madam Mayor, council members. Dave Breeze, Special Projects Manager. Tonight, we're here to obtain council's direction for the future treatment of the Halsey House located in Redwood Grove. Just for a little bit of background, the staff has taken steps to mitigate the hillside drainage concerns, roof repairs to eliminate known structural leaks, and eliminated rodent intrusions. The house is currently boarded up and surrounded with a security fence. The future of the Halsey House has been a topic of conversation for over 14 years. Over 40 public meetings have been held regarding this matter. At the May 25th, 2021 City Council meeting, Council identified 4 options for consideration and provided direction to staff to secure additional information on the project. The 4 options identified included the total rehabilitation of the Halsey House, the partial rehabilitation and partial demolition of the building, the complete demolition of the structure, and the mothballing of the Halsey House. Page and Turnbull have been secured to complete the historic resource evaluation on the structure and the families who lived there in the past. David J. Powers and Associates have prepared a memo addressing the California Environmental Quality Act, also known as CEQA, considerations for council's conversation. The Architectural Resources Group has developed a feasibility study noting specific rehabilitation elements and a cost estimate for each of the 4 options as council requested at its May meeting. Additionally, city planning staff have prepared a memo addressing possible floodplain considerations at the site. Some key observations as a result of the studies and reports that we've received is that the Halsey House is a local historic landmark which is eligible for state recognition as an historic resource. Any demolition of all or a portion of the structure would trigger the requirement for an environmental impact report to be prepared. Rehabilitation or mothballing of the house in compliance with the Secretary of the Interior standards would be exempt from review under CEQA, and assuming that no other environmental impacts are identified throughout the planning process. Other observations include a phased approach to the full rehabilitation of the Halsey House would allow for the preservation of an historic resource, the rehabilitation of the main portion of the house, the mothballing of 2 side bedroom wings, and for possible fundraising efforts to continue for the rehabilitation of the remaining bedroom wings. Actual use and the activities that occur inside the building do not impact the requirement of the need for an EIR should structural changes occur to the building. As mentioned earlier, the Halsey House has local historic landmark status. Some of the historic elements are identified in the Page and Turnbull report and include a chronology of the construction of the house. This slide demonstrates the areas that are considered, oops, I gotta move this out of the way, that are considered the original construction. The areas in blue shown in the center are the original 1923 footprint. Additions by the Halseys were done in 1928, which is represented by the green area in the upper left, and then sometime in the 30s by an addition in the lower right-hand corner. Alterations in the purple were done in post 1945. Consistent with the construction chronology of the house, significant areas of the house include the areas shown here in peach. These, again, are some of the original portions of the construction of the house as significant. The areas in yellow, which were mostly the additions, are considered contributing, and the areas in gray are non-contributing. This shows from the significance diagram from the north and south elevations, which is basically the front portion of the house. The front door on the north side is on the left, and then from the rear, which is the courtyard side. The elements that are considered as significant are shown in peach. And so that would be essentially from the roof down to the doors, to the windows, to the architecture that's there. From on the rear, on the south, it also includes the areas identified and associated with the courtyard, either as being significant or contributing. From the east and west views, you see it continues. The roof line, the windows, the doors, the architecture elements are either significant or contributing. The one gray area here is a door that's identified as non-contributing. From the actual inside the courtyard itself, we see that virtually all three sides of the courtyard in the structure are identified as significant and historic. Only one set of windows is contributing, and then one set of stairs as non-contributing. In detailing the 4 options for the site, we've also looked at the 4 different options and analyzed these, which are fully described in our report. Option number 1 calls for the full rehabilitation of the Halsey house, either all at once or in a phased approach. This option completely rehabilitates the house structure, minor interior modifications to allow for new restroom, kitchen, and accessibility upgrades, both within and to the site itself. CEQA considerations for this option are identified that this option would be categorically exempt under CEQA section 15331 and would not result in any delay to the project process, assuming no other environmental impacts are identified in the project planning stage. The pros to this option allows for the preservation and use of the historic resource and future recreation programs of the structure. The total rehabilitation of the Halsey, the con is that the total rehabilitation of the Halsey house may take several years to complete and would likely require private grant funds. Additionally, there would be possible project cost increases due to inflation or other factors if the construction is delayed or completed in phases. Let me just move that out of the way. The total known costs to rehabilitate the Halsey house under this option are estimated at approximately $4.6 million. Option number 2 calls for the partial rehabilitation and partial demolition of the Halsey house. This option rehabilitates the main section of the Halsey house and demolishes the 2 side bedroom wings. The CEQA consideration for this option identifies that it would cause substantial alteration to an historic structure and would require the development of an EIR, environmental impact report, and including possible project alternatives, and require all feasible mitigation measures to reduce the impact of the historic structure prior to proceeding with a construction project. The pros of this option, it allows the retention of a portion of the historic Halsey house while allowing for alternative use of the space surrounding the house itself. The cons, this option eliminates several of the character features which contribute to the structure's historic value. It adds costs and possible time delays due to the EIR requirements. It requires council to develop a list of findings and determinations to be outlined in the EIR document. The total known costs of this option are approximately $3.2 million. Option 3 calls for the full demolition of the Halsey house, which would demolish the historic structure in its entirety. Similar to option number 2, the option would cause substantial alterations to an historic structure and require an EIR be developed for it, including possible project alternatives prior to the development of a construction project. The pros of this option, it removes the Halsey house structure from Redwood Grove and allows for an alternative use of the site. The cons, this option would permanently remove an historic resource from Los Altos and eliminate the possibility of future generations from utilizing the resource. The total known cost for this option are approximately $290,000. Option number 4 calls for the mothballing of the Halsey house. This option would stabilize the existing condition of the Halsey house to prevent further deterioration of the structure itself. CEQA consideration here is that it would be considered categorically exempt under CEQA and would not result in any delay in the project process, assuming no other environmental impacts are identified in the project planning process. The pros, it stabilizes an existing historic resource and allows for possible rehabilitation efforts to occur at some point in the future. The cons, this option does not address the current opportunities nor the long-term plan for the historic Halsey house. The structure would still require ongoing maintenance and incur costs, meaning an annual appropriation for upkeep would be necessary. The total known costs for this option are approximately $250,000. It is important to note that the cost estimates provided tonight and in the reports are just that, estimates. There remain several unknown costs which may have minimal or significant cost impact on the overall project budget. These estimates have been provided to you to give you an order of magnitude of the different options. Once council identifies the scope of a Halsey house project, more accurate costs may be provided. In addition to the analysis of the 4 options, council asked several questions at its May 25th meeting. A complete list of responses may be found as attachment number 1 to our report. I wanted to highlight a few of the key questions here. Question number 1, what would trigger a delisting process? The following section of the Los Altos Municipal Code addresses terminating the designation of a historic resource or historic landmark. And I apologize that my these screens are in the way, but the Muni Code reference is 12.44.09, termination of designation. The only legitimate reason for terminating the designation of an historic resource or historic landmark is when clear evidence is presented that shows the resource no longer meets the criteria of section 12.44.040 due to loss of integrity and or historic significance. It should be noted that delisting the Halsey house from the city's list of historic landmarks would not change any requirements under CEQA because the structure has been deemed eligible for listing in the California Register of Historic Resources. It qualifies as an historic resource under CEQA, regardless of whether it is officially listed on the historic resource or as on the city's list of historic landmarks. What would be the impacts on the Redwood Grove with each of the 4 options? Page and Turnbull's August 2021 Historic Resource Evaluation, or the HRE, determined that the Halsey House and Redwood Grove are individually eligible for listing in the California Register of Historic Resources. The impact to the historic integrity and character defining features of the Redwood Grove resulting from potential removal of the Halsey House have not been analyzed. A qualified historian would need to complete an impact assessment to determine whether the removal of all or a portion of the Halsey House would alter the historic status of the Redwood Grove. Question number 7 read, what does adaptive reuse mean with each option? The term adaptive reuse is commonly defined as the process of reusing an existing building for a purpose other than which it was originally built. Only options 1, the full rehabilitation, and option 2, the partial rehabilitation, would be considered adaptive reuse, where the residential structure is being repurposed for general recreation programming. Question number 8, does adaptive reuse meet the Secretary of the Interior's requirements? It depends. According to the Secretary of the Interior standards, the treatment of historic properties, the term rehabilitation is the process of returning a property to a state of utility through repair or alteration, which makes possible for an efficient contemporary use while preserving those portions and features of the property which are significant to its historic, architectural, and cultural values. Thus, rehabilitation acknowledges the need to alter or add to an historic property to meet continuing and changing uses. Whether adaptive reuse meets the standards does not necessarily depend on the nature of the new use for which to which the property is put. Rather, the adaptive reuse meets the standards if those portions and features of the property which are significant to its historic, architecture, and cultural value are preserved. Frequently, adaptive reuse is done in a manner that does not meet the standards. For example, because full rehabilitation is cost prohibitive. However, adaptive reuse can be done in a manner that does meet the standards. And last, question number 13 read, does contemplation of a new structure, regardless of what it is, change the CEQA or legal risk analysis for a full or partial demolition? The response, contemplation of a new structure would not alter the CEQA risk in the sense that full or partial demolition would result in a significant unavoidable CEQA impact, regardless of whether a new structure is proposed. However, the impacts of constructing and operating the new structure would also need to be considered in the CEQA document prepared for the project. The CEQA analysis would need to include an assessment from an historian regarding potential impacts of the new structure on the historic status of the Redwood Grove. Further, if the city does not follow the CEQA requirements outlined in the David J. Powers and Associates report for the 4 options, then the city may be exposed to legal risk. I've gone through this presentation pretty quickly and with a lot of information tonight. While the intent of the information provided both here and in our report is intended to be robust and comprehensive, it is difficult to determine more specific answers until an actual project is defined by council. To that end, with us tonight to answer council's questions or provide any clarifications, we have our consultants. We have from Page and Turnbull, Barrett Reeder and Christina Dykes, Michael Listenby from David J. Powers and Associates, Lisa Yurgovich with the Architectural Resource Group, and staff available here to answer questions or provide clarifications. We have our city attorney, Jolie Houston, community development director, John Biggs, assistant city manager, John Maginot, associate planner, Sean Gallegos, and myself. And with that, this concludes staff's report.
Thank you, Mr. Breeze. Thanks for that very comprehensive presentation. Mr. England, I see that you have your video on. Did you have anything to add before we go to questions from council members?
No, Mayor, I was just getting ready.
You're getting ready, okay. So we're gonna do the normal process where we look to council members to see if they have any questions, and we have a big team with us this afternoon to answer our questions. And then we've already done public comment, and so then I will come back for discussion and direction as Mr. Breeze has requested. And so let's do rounds of
Mayor,
questions.
can I point out that the city attorney has had her hand raised?
Oh,
and I also think it shows me is Gabe. I think are there two Gabes?
So Ms. Houston, if you're raising your hand, can you please do virtual? Only because I have many boxes on my screen. So I would, for tonight, let's do virtual. So go ahead.
Just a couple suggestions or recommendations of when you're participating in this discussion, because we are making a record for the hearing, that we're discussing options, and we're not predetermining any sort of decision tonight. You're just exploring those options. These options, the option selected would come back to council for further deliberation, and none of the option chosen would not go forward until CEQA analysis was done. I just want to make sure that we don't get ahead of the CEQA determination for the object that you select. So I don't want any preconceived statements. And then also we have the consultants here, the environmental consultants and the historic consultants and some of the other consultants. And I think when you have questions, I would defer to them, because their opinions would be relevant to the record. And I will also be available, but I would like for you to use the consultants as much as possible. So those are just my housekeeping ideas.
No, thanks for those reminders, Ms. Houston. And I'll pick up on two things the city attorney just reminded us of. One is this is a study session, and what staff would like at the end of the study session is a more narrow focused direction to staff on where we want staff to go. We have 4 options before us. And so at the end, and we don't have to go till 6 p.m., but at the end of this afternoon study session, the goal is for us to really narrow the focus. And if we need any additional information in order for us to make that decision down the road, that's the kind of direction they're looking for from us this afternoon. And then the second point I'll make, just following up on what Ms. Houston said, we have a lot of questions, I'm sure, and we're going to look to staff and the consultants to determine who answers the questions, right? Because we don't know who should answer the questions, so we may throw out questions. And so we will look to you, staff and consultants, to answer the questions as appropriate. Okay, so with that, I will start with Councilmember Meadows. And again, I'm using virtual hands. Go ahead, Councilmember Meadows.
Thank you, Mayor, and I'm glad you said that, because I don't know who to refer the questions to. So I'll ask, and then if someone could step up as best appropriate. So in options 2 and 3, which are either partial or complete demolition, apparently, if we were to go that route, they're going to, CEQA looks for a statement of overriding considerations with specific legal, social, technological, or other benefits that outweigh unavoidable adverse environmental impact. And we need to include substantial evidence and explain why feasible project alternatives were not selected. So first of all, I hope I've paraphrased that correctly from what I read in those options. And if not, someone can say that that's not right. And then the rest of the question is probably irrelevant, but I think I've got it right. So I'm wondering what an example of an overriding consideration might be. Would cost prohibitive be an overriding consideration? I suspect not. Would floodplain issues be overriding considerations? Can we get some hypothetical examples, not necessarily associated with this project, but what are such items that might be considered overriding considerations that outweigh unavoidable adverse environmental impact?
I'm going to invite Mike Listenby from David J. Powers and Associates. He is our CEQA consultant on the project. And so I'm going to invite Mike to weigh in on that.
Good evening. Like Dave said, Mike Lisenby from David J. Powers and Associates. Those are excellent questions, and without simple answers, I'd say for a typical project that's proposing to impact a historic resource, there is a proposed project that would take its place on the property. For example, if in a downtown area of a city, there's a historic building and somebody wants to develop a new structure that's larger, more modern, has a different use. An example of an overriding consideration from the city's perspective would be it's a better use of the property. It is in alignment with the city's general plan policies for development in that area of the city. It brings jobs and financial benefits to the city. Those are examples of overriding considerations where a city can show that the benefits of a project outweigh the adverse impacts of the demolition of the resource. Cost prohibitiveness is typically not a viable option, except in extreme circumstances. So I'd say in this case that it's pretty unlikely to be an overriding consideration unless there is substantial evidence to show that it is prohibitive for the city to undergo some other option on the project. The floodplain issue is an interesting one. I think there would have to be substantial evidence that the location in a floodplain presents a hazard to the project that can't be mitigated through any other means, and that demolition of the building is the only option to remove that hazard, which again, I think if one of the options on the table is mothballing and not any kind of active use of the building, I think may be a difficult case to make unless you could demonstrate that the flood in that area of that building would present a hazard to surrounding properties.
Yeah, Mayor, just as a way of background for the council, when you get into statement of overriding considerations, you do look at social, technological, and other benefits of the project, and you don't get that until you're in an EIR and adopting a statement of overriding consideration. When you do an exemption or a mitigated neg deck, you never look at the social or economic or those types of considerations. It's only when you get into a statement of overriding considerations. Usually you make your decision without looking at that, but the council will be able to, under CEQA, make a statement of overriding consideration, and it's the legislative body that would make that determination. And Michael, did I summarize that? I mean, yes. You never look at the economics or the social or the technological aspects during CEQA until you get into an EIR and you are adopting a statement of overriding consideration. So it can be done, but it needs to be supported by evidence in the record, and you need to weigh and balance all of those. So there would be some very specific findings that you would need to make.
Okay, thank you. Very clear. I have just one more question, Mayor. So it was interesting to me, and I just want to confirm that I'm getting this correct from reading the material, that the original basis in 1981, I believe, on which this was made historic, is actually not supported by the current HRE, because that was on the basis of persons and I forget one of the other criteria. But the HRE does find that it is historic on the basis of criterion number 1. So, and so I would just like that confirmed in layman's language for all of us to understand sort of that changing playing field, and if what I said is just what I said just now is correct, and why it's still historic and relevant in that sense.
Great. I see Barrett's monitor on, so I'm gonna invite her to give the response.
Hi, I'm Barrett Ryder from Page and Turnbull. I was the primary author on the HRE, and you have it exactly correct. The property was originally landmarked in the 80s before we really had an approach that was standardized, particularly the California Register. So as Los Altos has developed its HRI more thoroughly, particularly in 2012, it established criteria that are in line with the California Register and National Register criteria. So the option of the HRE really gave us a chance to dive into the history, provide a little bit more nuance, and look at a number of other properties in the area that sort of remove this property as a rare example of an architectural style, but the building clearly still is unique for its significance related to Emma Halsey and the establishment of Redwood Grove. So we just sort of incorporated some of that original finding and the significance of the building into this criteria 1 significance that discusses the events of the property, the development of Los Altos, and the role of certain people in that development.
Thank you. I'm finished, Mayor.
Thank you, Councilmember Meadows. Who would like to go next? Don't see any hands. I'm going to be Mayor Pepper and start calling on people. Councilmember Weinberg, do you want to go next?
Thank you, Mayor. I think my most pressing questions are really for staff. We're looking at north of $4.5 million for full rehabilitation and more than $3 million for adaptive reuse. Where are we going to get this money? Or earlier this year, we put all of our CIPs on hold because we didn't know if we were going to have enough money for that. So where is this money going to come from? And to the extent that you're going to answer, we're going to fundraise from the community. Can you please explain to me how much Los Altos has raised from the community for other projects and how much staff time would be involved in that process?
Thank you, Councilmember Weinberg. So assuming the City Council wants staff to move forward with any of the options, when we brought the staff report to Council, our recommendation would include potential funding sources. For the option you're asking for specifically, sources of funding could include the general fund, park and lieu fees, or potentially grant funding. I've not been here long enough to know what we fundraised for in the past, but if fundraising was an option the council went down, we'd certainly have to look at some type of arrangement where a foundation or other charitable trust was established, so not a lot of staff time would be spent on it after the incorporation.
What's not a lot of staff time?
Again, it depends on which option and what amount. So as an example, if council chooses an option for phased rehabilitation and phase 1 is very minimal, then including starting with mothballing, then it would be almost no staff time. If council chose full rehabilitation, it would be a wider scope. So it's a little difficult to speculate on specific funding sources when we don't have an option selected in front of us by council.
Okay. And what are the projects that staff is going to be taken away from that will have to be delayed if we move forward with trying to fundraise?
I'm not sure that fundraising in and of itself would cause projects to be delayed. If we're going with full rehabilitation, to your point, we delayed other CIP projects. So we'd have to look at what projects we have and determine what the correct balance is. But again, that would more come forward at the recommendation point. I understand it's important for council to weigh this when you consider the alternatives. But the options before council are so vastly different that it's difficult until it's narrowed down a little bit to give a more concrete answer.
Okay. And Mr. England, you've identified the buckets that we're going to pull from to the extent that council, that the city is going to be paying for this. But where is the money going to come from to fill those buckets? Aren't we have to jump in? Aren't we going to have to invade our reserves in order to be able to pay $1 million, $2 million for this project?
So there's a fund balance in Park and Lieu currently that would be sufficient for the project. We could look at different capital projects. If council decided, for example, this was a top priority, we could look at different capital projects and not use the reserves. Or if the city council decided that when the capital project review comes forward, they wanted to add this project, then at that point, yes, we would have to go into reserve funding because this amount is not in the budget. But again, even the full rehabilitation, the most expensive option, would not happen all at once. So as an example, if council chose that, we'd move forward with some type of conceptual or construction drawings, which would probably be a 10% cost, and we could budget that in next year's budget as an example.
Okay. Thank you for your answers on that question. I do have another question, which I think the answer to this is no, but it wasn't quite clear to me from the staff report. Has a city building inspector or fire chief or other code enforcement officer determined that Halsey House is unsafe or dangerous and cannot be rectified through the use of the California State Historic Building Code?
So to the first part of that question, that might either be Mr. Breeze or Mr. Biggs.
Good evening, Madam Mayor, members of the council. John Biggs with your Community Development Department. The answer to the first part of the question is no.
And then back to you, Mr. England. It appears that staff is very much in favor of this phased approach. Could you please describe how the phased approach would work? Financially, how it would work, how that would dovetail with CEQA. I'm unclear exactly on how you envision it all coming together.
So I believe option number one, I apologize, I'm scrolling through the PowerPoint. I believe option number one would be exempt from CEQA. So we wouldn't need to go through that process as long as it was rehabilitated under the correct guidelines, which it would be. So from if council was to select this option, we'd probably move forward first with conceptual drawings or construction drawings and determine the actual true cost, look at some floodplain considerations, look at access considerations, and then start moving through the process. But if it was a full rehabilitation that happened in phases, we would then move to the elements that Mr. Breeze pointed out that are currently historic and intact, and we'd move to secure those and rehabilitate those first, while mothballing other areas of the property until such time the city had the funds to rehabilitate those as well.
So we would have the front part of the building, more or less, the center part of the building in use for city purposes, and then the two wings would be quote unquote mothballed.
That is probably the most likely option if we chose a rehabilitation to happen in phases. If we chose a full rehabilitation to happen quickly, then it would happen a little bit differently. With regards to the comments on city purposes, at this point, we haven't considered programs or use. We're simply considering the rehabilitation, but I do suspect that statement is correct. We would use it for programs.
All right. If we mothball either the entire building or part of the building, what is that going to look like? Does that essentially mean what we have right now? Is it currently mothballed?
So I think the way we're using mothballing is to secure it and make it safe while rehabilitating other parts of it. So again, you'd see a usable part of the structure, the historic parts of the structure. You'd probably see outside treatments and improvements, but not necessarily making the full improvements on the interior, and then mothballing the rest. I don't know what we have today would be considered full mothballing, but if council did choose that option, we would, it would probably look similar to how it does today, but we may have to add additional safety features or additional maintenance currently. And then as we put in the staff report, we would expect to have an obligation to maintain annually, so we don't get in a situation where we were just at where we had to put an emergency tarp on the roof because there was a leak, as an example.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking. I remember one of the historic commissioners mentioned that they were going up on the roof themselves, putting tarps on. And we have these fences around the building right now, and obviously the plywood over the entrances, over the windows. So mothballing essentially is going to keep that same aesthetics, that same, the same situation. It's not prettying it up at all. It's just keeping it as a construction zone, more or less.
It would be working to make it safe, yes, and also to reduce liability to the extent practical. It may change a little bit, but again, the idea would be to keep people out of it until the city council could make a decision on the ultimate disposition of the property.
Okay, thank you, Mr. England. My next question is probably for a consultant, and forgive me, I don't know who, but it has to do with the anticipated cost of each of the 4 options. Now, in reading the report, and as Mr. Breeze made clear, these numbers are estimates, and of course they have to be estimates. But I am curious what circumstances, how can we expect these numbers to change? And my belief is that they're probably going to go up. And the longer we take to move forward, the more they're going to go up, simply because that's how inflation and the construction industry works. But are there other events that we should be aware of? Are there other happenings that that the consultants believe would cause the cost of each of the options to rise significantly?
I'm going to invite Lisa Yurkovich with the Architectural Resource Group to join us, and they are the ones that provided the cost estimation for the feasibility study.
Hi, I'm Lisa Yurkovich with ARG. So we work with a consultant to provide the cost estimate. And so the costs that are provided in the report are intended to be 2021 costs. So if the work was being done today, as laid out in the scope items that we had identified. I agree with you, costs will only go up. I would say there's 3 factors that might you would look at as you go into the future. First is if your building continues to deteriorate and conditions worsen, then you're going to have to be doing additional repair measures that are going to increase your costs. Secondly is just inflation. I think usually rule of thumb, we assume about 5% per year inflation costs. And then third, I would just say, any kind of market conditions that will change over the years. Obviously, construction costs are very, very high right now. It's hard to get contractors to bid, and so that can affect the overall costs. So I would say inflation, construction market, and then just if the building continues to deteriorate, that's going to affect your costs in the next few years.
Okay, I appreciate that, and I'm going to refrain from asking the question, what do you anticipate is going to happen, because it's not a fair question, but I appreciate the answer. Madam Mayor, I think I'm done with my questions.
Thank you, Councilmember Weinberg. All right, I'm going to keep, wait, I see. Go ahead, Vice Mayor.
Okay, so thank you to the staff and to the consultants for really bringing us back a package that I think is going to allow us to move forward. It's been a long time coming and getting the pieces, so I appreciate everyone's work that has gone into this. Thank you also, Ms. Dickus, I think, for clarifying that the change in designation, the nature, the qualifying element for the designation as a historic resource is really a matter that the change from the original one is a matter of a change and a development and clarification in criteria and how they're applied, rather than there having been an error per se in the original designation. So I think that's very helpful. I want to thank Councilmember Weinberg for asking some very insightful questions with respect to cost and so on. I do think it's important, and this is a question now, and I'm not sure to whom. Similarly, I don't know who to direct this to, but I don't know that it would be correct to equate partial demolition to adaptive reuse. I think from what I'm reading here that we should probably stay away from using the phrase adaptive reuse and limit ourselves to the specific of the terms that are in the 4 options as described. And anybody who wants to contradict me, please speak up if I'm missing an understanding of that. Based on the slide that Mr. Breeze showed. I think it's also great information that this qualifies as a historic resource.
There was their question there. I'm sorry.
So this is all putting the pieces together. Where my question is in the staff report, there is a phraseology in options 2 and 3 under additional information that says, in addition, the city building inspector or fire chief or other code enforcement officer would need to determine the building is unsafe or dangerous condition which cannot be rectified through the use of the California State Historic Building Code. Is there someone who can comment? Because the way I would read that is, it's not just a matter of getting a declaration from an inspector or fire chief or whatever as to the unsafe condition, but that additional phraseology, which cannot be rectified through the use of the California State Historic Building Code, seems to me really sets a pretty high bar for being able to make that assertion in an EIR. Can someone comment on that or clarify that for me?
I can comment on it if the mayor is okay with that. The California Historic Building Code is used typically in conjunction with the California Building Code. And you're correct, it would take a lot of additional research and evaluation, actually, getting into the structure of the building and kind of doing the exploratory demolition to determine whether or not elements of the California Historic Building Code could be relied on to successfully keep the building standing and being rehabilitated. Typically, how the California Historic Building Code is used is it allows for some older unique features related to the architectural elements or design of the structure, or maybe some unique framing methods that cannot be changed because they are part of or in conjunction with the design or the type of architecture of the building. So it's something that hasn't been used a whole heck of a lot here in Los Altos, but there's been nothing that I'm aware of, at least, that says that this structure could not be rehabilitated through a combination of the current building code and the historic building code.
And the historic building code, as I understand it, Mr. Biggs, is basically there essentially to facilitate the rehabilitation of historic buildings by allowing for, if you will, a deviation from the standard building code.
That's exactly correct.
Okay.
In certain situations, it allows for deviations of the historic building code in order, or excuse me, the regular building code, in order to preserve historic and unique features of the historic building.
Okay.
I would like to invite Lisa back on so that we can, because Lisa addressed the question in the council question as far as adaptive reuse, and doing that as well as can address the historic building code consideration.
And Ms. Yurgovich, before you start, City Attorney, did you want to make a comment?
Yes, I wanted to comment that there are 2 ways a historic resource could be demolished in the city, and one would require a historical alteration permit, which would go to the Historic Commission and make findings, and then that denial could be appealed to the council, but that would still require CEQA. And then as an alternative, there is the section where the building official or the fire official could say that it's a dangerous condition, and they would not need to go through that process. They would just be issued the permit because of the dangerous situation. But they would look at it that it cannot be rehabbed or made safe, even using the historic building code. So that's a very, health and safety concern. And then there are two processes. And the second one with using the historic building code, that would be in an extreme situation where action needed to be taken immediately. And so, but there are two processes.
I'm sorry, I didn't really understand the first process, City Attorney.
Is that with the Historical Commission?
Yes.
Go ahead, Jolie.
I'm not sure what the outcome or the circumstance that you're talking about and why you would go one way versus the other way. You're muted.
I'm muted, Jolie.
One would be if the city wanted to demolish a historic landmark, and it would have to go through the city's process, and that would also mean CEQA and the EIR and all of that. And you would have to make all those statements of overriding consideration. You could go through that process. There is another process where if the building's been determined to be unsafe, you don't need to go to the HLC or the Historic Commission, but you would have to make findings that it was a dangerous building.
So let me paraphrase my understanding. If we wanted to demolish a historic resource and it wasn't a dangerous situation, we were using other criteria to justify demolition, we could go through the first process you described, which would involve the historic, the commission, as well as potentially an EIR and so on. But if there was a dangerous circumstance, we would use the second process you described, which involves a fire or public safety official or whatever. Have I got that part right?
Yes.
You're muted. Okay. And then again, my core question is, even, I think you answered this, even if you're pursuing a dangerous situation, there's still a high bar that says you can only demolish if you can't basically rehabilitate using the historic building codes.
Yes, and I'll let Lisa add to that, but
go ahead, Ms. Yurgovich.
Thank you. So I think what Mr. Biggs had said was correct about the historic building code supplementing the regular building code. I will say that our firm, as part of the historic structures report that was done, did have a structural engineer evaluate the building, and structural deficiencies were noted in the building, but there was no indication that the structure of the building itself posed any threat to kind of life or safety. So while the city may have to do its own determination of that, I just want to state that based on our assessment, that did not seem to be the case.
Great, thank you. Mayor, I think that's my only questions for now.
Thank you, Vice Mayor. Councilmember Lee Eng.
Thank you so much. I think that my question would be to Lisa, since she just answered that last question for me. So Lisa, based on the information you just referred to and other information that I've read in the report, does it sound to you that 2 and 3 are even viable?
Partial demolition and demolition.
Mm-hmm.
So they're only viable if I think the CEQA process would allow them.
But based on the information you just gave me, it doesn't, but thank you for the response. I'll just go to my next question. Some of the data and the information that you referred to talked about how this in 2012, it aligned with the National Historic Registry. So If we applied for a National Historic Registry, wouldn't that give us more opportunities to seek further grant funding? Or maybe staff can answer that.
I think I might defer to.
Yeah, I'm gonna invite Barrett back on and Christina. That was something that was handled under the Page and Turnbull report.
Hi there, this is Christina Dykes from Page and Turnbull. If the property was considered eligible for listing in the National Register of Historic Places, there is a possibility that the city could seek, well, let me think about this. I was going to say the city could seek federal tax credits, but it's possible that that may not be applicable for city-owned properties. I believe that it's applicable to properties that are income producing. And then I don't know if the city of Los Altos has a Mills Act program, but primarily National Register listing is honorary. So the only real benefit that you might seek would be that federal tax credits. And then I'd have to look into whether this property could apply.
Okay, and what would that federal tax credit entail for us, or what benefit, when you don't know? So you would have to look up that information and share it with us.
Yes, yeah, that's not something that I was prepared to talk about today. I'm sorry.
Okay.
The very basics are that there is a 3-step process. The first is to determine that the property is eligible for listing in the National Register of Historic Places. The second is that a rehabilitation project is detailed and then reviewed by the state historic, the Office of Historic Preservation and the National Park Service, and approved. And then the third part, after the project is completed and the tax credits are about to be received, that the property is officially listed in the National Register at the end.
Okay, thank you. And then the next question is for staff. So staff, if we were to be having a normal meeting today, you would have provided us with a recommendation. Which recommendation would you be providing us with?
Councilmember Liang, if we were at a council meeting, we would be providing a recommendation. The reason is at a study session we don't is we want to hear the council discussion and questions, get all the information we can before providing a recommendation. So including tonight, council, we're hoping will eliminate options. So our recommendation would be based on one of the options that the council selects for moving forward.
So no options would be, I mean, none here seems more, based on all the information on the reports, does it seem more, the more feasible option or more logical option that we should be pursuing?
Councilmember Liang, I think certain options are probably more feasible than others, including time and cost and all sorts of factors. But again, tonight is for the city council to provide staff with direction so we can give a recommendation. It's a policy decision still at this point, as none of the 4 options have been eliminated by the city council.
Okay, and then my next question is for the consultant. So I'm asking the consultant, I think, who would be the specialist on his, I guess, Mr. Breeze, you can determine who would be answering the question. If we continued on the road that we were doing on our previous maintenance, does that fall under normal maintenance of a historic landmark? So everything we've done in the previous years, does that fall under what should be done or considered normal maintenance of a historic landmark?
There are standards by the Secretary of the Interior for mothballing the resource. And so we would, if the council chooses to pursue that, then we would determine what those measures are and come back with a budget appropriation to implement those options, those measures.
Okay, no, my question was what we were doing, did that fall under?
It's
Considered
consistent with,
normal
but there's
maintenance?
more that can be done.
I'm sorry, that wasn't clear to me.
The steps we are taking are consistent with the Secretary of the Interior standards, but they're not complete. And so more work would need to be done. And it all depends on, are we mothballing it for a short period of time while we make steps ready for a long-term solution? If we go with the full rehabilitation or partial phase, that's a shorter term versus we want to consider this, but not at this time. And so we want you to mothball it for the next 5 years and bring it back to us in 5 years. That would take us down a different path. So again, we're looking for your direction so that we can come back and give you appropriate recommendations as a result.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Any more questions, Councilmember Liang? Okay, I think she's on mute. Okay, all right.
Good. I'm good, thank you.
Thank you.
I think, Mayor, that the city attorney had a comment, but she's now gone off video, so maybe she's.
No, what I was going to say is in the David Powers report, it did talk about the mothballing. And they acknowledge that some steps have been taken, but further mothballing or prevention measures would be needed, and they would have to adhere to the Department of Interior standards for the mothballing. And what we would need to do is make sure that we're doing those measures and protecting the integrity of the building and the foundation, and you need to secure it from water, but then you also need to allow adequate ventilation and some other things under those standards. But we're doing some, but if that's the decision you ultimately go with, we would have to determine what exactly would be required.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Houston. So I will ask my questions now, and I see we have Councilmember Weinberg with his hand up again. So I will definitely, give everybody another opportunity, and then maybe we can discuss it and narrow the focus as staff is asking us to do. So I'm going to start with the question about the 4 options that were presented, because I assume, Mr. England, that you would not have presented options that weren't feasible. So notwithstanding time, cost, and process associated with each option, I just want to confirm that any of these options is feasible for us to pursue.
Correct, Mayor. Council could pursue any of the 4 options.
Thank you. So picking up, and Councilmember Meadows asked a couple of my questions earlier, so thank you, Councilmember Meadows. On the mothballing option, I do want to better understand the cost estimate here that's in our staff report. Is that limited to a certain number of years?
I'm going to invite Lisa back on to talk about the cost estimates.
Okay, so typically, with mothballing, and we say in the report up to 10 years is a reasonable amount of time that you can mothball a building, assuming you take the steps that are laid out there. And the whole point of mothballing is just to slow deterioration. The building is going to continue to deteriorate, but you're slowing it and taking those additional measures in order to do so.
And so this is the total estimated cost for up to the 10-year mark.
It's the initial cost. We have not provided ongoing maintenance, maintaining, the secure, the fencing and the plywood. So it's the initial upfront cost.
Thank you. And then I want to go back to the HRI just to better understand where we are today. And this may be Ms. Yurgovich, that under the current Los Altos standards, if I'm hearing the presentation correctly. It means we have not actually evaluated Halsey House under the current standards. In 1981, it was designated as a historic landmark under the then standards. But today we're really looking at the current standards and speculating based on what we know that it would still qualify under today's standards. Is that correct?
I'm going to invite Paige and Turnbull Barrett to come on. They're the ones that actually completed the historic resource evaluation.
Yeah, so the HRE that we completed evaluates the property as a California Register eligible property, but since the local regulations for Los Altos state that it has to have physical integrity over 50% of the original materials, it has to meet an age threshold, and then it has to meet one of the criteria of significance of the California Register or the National Register. So in this case, we've determined that it does meet a California Register criteria and it would continue to be a landmark. And then the difference of Los Altos historic resources versus historic landmarks is that a landmark is a rare or unique property type. And when you take this building with its landscape, it is definitely rare and unique. So it wasn't a jump to just say that it is going to continue being a landmark as long as it retains its physical integrity.
Thank you. And then on the floodplain recommendations, and there were a couple in that last memo, were the costs associated with those recommendations factored into the cost estimates that we have for the different options?
We have Steve Golden here with us, who drafted that memo. I'm going to invite Steve to provide that comment.
Well, I'm not aware of the work that that would have to be done to make the structure more flood resistant, and whether or not the cost estimates included some of that, but that would definitely, if it was not included and the council wanted to make the building more flood resistant, that would essentially increase the cost. I think that has to be further evaluated. As noted in the memo, if the structure remains as a historic structure, you essentially don't have to follow any of the regular NFIP standards. But that being said, with the cost and the improvements being done to the structure, you probably want to look at maintaining or increasing some of the flood resiliency, just because it might be damaged, and to reduce those potential risks. But at the initial onset, as again noted in the memo, you probably want to do some initial assessment with regards to where the building sits in relation to the flood zone area around there, because the mapping, for whatever reason, is not all that great. And we find that throughout the city. Sometimes the maps are based on really high level data, and you would expect to be a little bit more accurate, but they're not until you get a surveyor or an engineer on the ground. So that's something that if I were to make a recommendation, is spend some time and effort in understanding what the flood potential is before you potentially make that investment.
Thanks, Mr. Golden. And then still on the cost piece, and I'm looking at the rehabilitation option, but I think in the report it also mentions the mothballing option. And I want to confirm, because on the one hand, I'm hearing that for the rehabilitation and the mothballing, it would be exempt from CEQA. But actually, that's assuming that there are no other environmental impacts that are discovered during the planning process. Is that correct, Mr. Breeze?
That is correct. And some of those, and Lisa can chime in here too, as far as the cost estimates, but as far as what we know and what we don't know, and it depends on the option that you choose. And then from there, we can go forward and determine the actual, the impact and the cost, so.
Right, so rehabilitation and mothballing may be subject to CEQA review depending on what we learn during the planning process.
Well, we know that they will be subject to CEQA review if we don't follow the Secretary of the Interior's mothballing standards. We know that, hey, if we're going to pursue any of those options, if we color inside the lines, then we're going to be okay. If we go and we're not compliant with that, then we will trigger the CEQA, whether it's a full-blown CEQA review or a minor one, a neg deck or whatever. Then that will be determined.
But isn't it? But also, a CEQA analysis could be triggered even if you do all the things you're describing, but as we're going through the process, we learn of other environmental impacts that we didn't know today. Isn't that correct, Ms. Houston?
Yes, and so because if we're going under, and Jay Powers, they can chime in here too.
Right.
If we're doing an exemption, you cannot mitigate an exemption. So if we get into any sort of, we find soil contamination, or we have to use certain pesticides or something that could have another effect on the environment, we would have to address that. So, but for the exemption to apply, we definitely need to follow all the Secretary of Interior standards for the mothballing.
Thank you.
Mike, did you have anything you wanted to add on that?
No, I would agree with Ms. Houston's comment. There is some case law about unusual circumstances. So typically a project that is exempt does not have to investigate impacts, secondary impacts, unless it can be demonstrated that there are unusual circumstances associated with the project. And I would defer to Ms. Houston and maybe if we had more time to dig into it, but there is some case law regarding this exact scenario that we could provide some information on.
Thank you, Mike. And then my next question has to do with the delisting process, because I'm still not clear on what would trigger that process. So hypothetically, if we were looking at option 2, the partial rehabilitation, would we need to delist the property? Would we have to go, like, what triggers the delisting?
Mike, do you want to handle that one?
I'm sorry, I was busy investigating that case law. Could you repeat the question?
I think it's the city of Berkeley.
What triggers?
Yes, that's right, Ms. Houston.
He's on West Lawn. I'm trying to understand what triggers the delisting process.
I believe there is a provision in the city code for delisting, but I'm not an expert in that, but from the CEQA perspective, the delisting is irrelevant for the most part. The structure is a historic resource under CEQA regardless of its listing status, merely by its eligibility for listing in the California Register.
And I would add that we don't have to delist to take any of these actions, these 4 options. And so, but even delisting, even though it's not really an option right now, would still require CEQA.
No, thanks, Ms. Houston. You answered my question. So none of these options would trigger the delisting process. And then my last question, and I just want to understand, of the 4 options, or maybe this is a 5th option, but is there a way to preserve the integrity, the historic integrity, without doing the full rehabilitation? And would that be option 2? Who's going to take that one?
Mayor, yes, I think we could look at the elements of the home that Mr. Bree showed earlier that were the historic elements in nature, rehabilitate those, and then not worry so much about the items that weren't historic. I was going to say mothballing. It wouldn't quite be mothballing. It would kind of be like decommissioning, and then we work to make them safe. So I think that would be a partial rehabilitation that stops short of a phased full rehabilitation.
Thank you. Okay, that's it for me with questions. I'm going back to the panelist link. Councilmember Weinberg, you had your hand up. It's fine if you have no follow-up questions. We can go straight to discussion. Did you have other questions, or they were?
No, you already asked it.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so now let's have a discussion amongst council members on the direction, focus. If there's additional information we would like staff to provide when they bring this to us at a future regular council meeting. And I think one of the things we heard loud and clear from our city manager, to the extent we can eliminate any of these options, they would welcome that. So I'm happy. So based on the discussion, let me start with, complete demolition. Any discussion on complete demolition? Anybody in favor of complete demolition? Does anybody need additional information related to demolition? And I'm looking for virtual hands. Okay. So can we eliminate? Okay, go ahead. I can see you, Councilmember Weinberg.
I don't think we can take complete demolition off the table. I just don't. And I think it's really a question of cost.
Any comment on the demolition option? Vice Mayor.
It's pretty clear to me, based on the clarifications we got, that the 4 options were not options that the consultant invented. These are options we asked for. And they aren't all feasible in my view. The legal hurdles for demolition or partial demolition are so high that it seems to me, yeah, we can choose to run headlong into the brick walls of 2 and 3, but I don't know why we would do that at all. So I'm very much in favor of at least taking full demo off the table at this point, because I simply do not believe that cost is going to be our friend as an argument in any way. And I don't see any other arguments that would be legally persuasive to allow us to do that.
And Vice Mayor, when you say legal hurdles, what are you referring to?
I'm talking about the criteria within CEQA for making a finding that of overriding considerations, and that or that we could not rehab this back to either mothball it, which is the least expense option that preserves the resource, or rehabilitate it.
Why is staff wrong?
No one here has talked about. No one here has talked about the hazards of litigation. It's mentioned as a one-liner in the report, but and really apart from that, I simply don't see it as feasible.
Councilmember Meadows.
My question picks up on the Vice Mayor's, which is, we've talked about legal risks, and I'm sure I won't get an answer to this question. Maybe the city attorney would care to comment, but what is the magnitude? So if we were just really bad and did something that we couldn't justify, what does that legal risk look like?
If we do not follow the CEQA process, and even if we do a full EIR, we would have to be craft the project alternatives would need to be addressed, and we would have to address if they are feasible or not. And part of that is, are they feasible and do they meet the project's objectives? And then we could be challenged because we didn't look at all the alternatives, but under CEQA, you only have to do a reasonable range of alternatives. You don't have to do each and every or have an exhaustive list of alternatives. There could be some exposure there. There could also be exposure to the city not adequately responding to comments. So under an EIR, when you get comments on a project, you have to respond, and they cannot just be cursory responses. You have to address the issue. Some EIRs have to go back and be redone because the response to comments are inadequate. And I think that would be where, or the statement like in the City of Woodside case, it was a historic building that the town wanted to demolish. The statement of overriding consideration was determined to be inadequate because it wasn't supported, the findings weren't supported by evidence in the record. So so that would be the vulnerability with an EIR. An EIR would protect the city more than a negative deck or a mitigated neg deck. But there's risk in it, just if there's risk in an exemption if the exemption is if we get if we do activities that remove it from the exemption.
That doesn't, so yeah, that's a lot of risk. I don't know what that looks like dollar wise, whether that's, $4 million worth of risk. And I know you can't say.
Well, I can say that if we lose, we pay the attorney's fees. So it's one of those litigation matters where if we lose, one, we go back to fix the findings and we do all of that. And, but under CEQA, the prevailing party will be awarded their attorney's fees and costs.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Councilmember Lee Eng.
I'm concerned about the legal risk as well. And I think the city attorney's response to me was not sufficiently adequate in really identifying the risks there. But I am definitely concerned. We have, like she said, neighboring examples, Woodside, Griffin House, and I don't think that we should just keep demolition on the table if it's only just one council member asking to keep demolition on the table. So I think our goal is to try to make it easier to eliminate some of the options here and move it forward.
And let me pick up on that, Councilmember Lee Eng. To move it forward, I'm also fine. Councilmember Meadows, I wasn't clear on your position on demolition, but I'm also fine taking demolition off the table. And I don't know, and it's Vice Mayor sounds like she also is fine taking it off the table, and Councilmember Lee Eng. So definitely there's consensus to eliminate one option. Mr. England should be happy. We're down to 3. And I can get us, so, again, we're not making any decisions tonight. I would be very interested in staff coming back with option number 2, whereby we look at preserving the historical elements and integrity of the house without having a full-blown rehabilitation of the Halsey house with wings and main section and courtyard. And I've, many concerns related to that. And I know we haven't gone into the topic of use. We're all familiar, we've all been to Redwood Grove. I'm sure we know the location. I'm concerned about fire engine access. I'm concerned about the floodplain issue. I'm concerned about the impact on the neighborhood. And so I would be interested in definitely having staff come back with option 2 and seeing if there's a way to do some kind of partial rehabilitation, but not the full-blown structure. With regards to the mothballing, for me, the mothballing would support either 1 or 2, depending on where council decides to go. I think mothballing stays on because even with partial rehabilitation, we may not be able to do that in one phase. It may require multiple phases. And so mothballing to me is a secondary option to either 1 or 2. And so that's where I am. I think I would want more information on option 2. But I'm going to look to my colleagues. Let's do number 2. So we're talking about option 2. So a demolition is off the table. Councilmember Meadows.
Okay, I was going to chime in that I also think that demolition has to be off the table. At this point, I guess you could argue a scenario where mothballing and then later you looked at it. But I think for now, for the purposes of staff's focusing, I think demolition has to be off the table. I do agree with you. I want to ask one question about number 2, because the way I've heard you first ask the question about partial rehabilitation made me think that you were going to, is there a scenario with partial rehabilitation that would get rid of the need for the CEQA? And I thought that the report was fairly clear that no, that partial rehabilitation would always entail CEQA. But the way you asked the question, Mayor, it sounded like you were going. So clearly, if there were an option for partial rehabilitation that avoided CEQA, that would be attractive, but you didn't bring that forward. So I assume that might not be the case.
Because of the demolition piece, yes.
Well, well, that option says and partial demolition. I guess, well, okay, I'll let staff take that.
Ms. Houston?
Well, the partial rehabilitation or partial demolition, it would be identified as a significant unavoidable impact to a historic resource under CEQA. So there you're in EIR land at that point. So it you would definitely have to look at it, and then that would include some project alternatives as well. So.
Okay, but if you took the approach, the direction the mayor was going, which I also believe that mothballing is potentially a tool to facilitate, well, it has to be a tool anyway when you look at the building, but to facilitate 1 or 2, and if 2 is really partial rehabilitation with mothballing, you could partially rehabilitate the primary. So when we talked about partial rehabilitation and partial demolition, the wings were demolished and the main structure, I'll call it, was retained. If you actually did a scenario where you had partial rehabilitation and mothballing of the wings, but no demolishing, is that, what kind of alternatives does that sound like, staff? I see Gabe is either laughing or smiling, not sure.
Yeah, it's 2A or 2B.
I'm not sure either, Councilmember Meadows. I am laughing. We had a hard time making sure we're all using the same terms when we were talking about the same things. So we finally settled on our terms. And I think maybe to clarify, we make a distinction between partial rehabilitation and phased rehabilitation. So what you're describing is actually option number 1, where it's full rehabilitation, but it doesn't happen all at once. It happens in phases. So phase 1, again, just as an example, would be the historic elements of the house, where the others are in another phase, and they may be mothballed until such a time that the city is ready to move forward with that. So if the question is, can we do phased rehabilitation? The answer is yes, and that would be option 1. And option 2 would be rehabilitation where we're actually demolishing a piece of the house. Option 1 would not require CEQA, option 2 would.
Well, option 1 could require a CEQA depending on what we learn as we go through the process. Councilmember Lee Eng.
I think we're moving in the right direction. To make things easier, we're eliminating some of the options that we all can find, majority of us do not want to even consider. So I think that as I hear the discussions going, the full mothballing is something I think we should really take off the table as well and start narrowing down. So I think I would like to make sure we just start taking that off the table and then narrow down more.
No, Councilmember Lee, I appreciate what you're saying. I do. I like the term that Councilmember Meadows used. It's the tool. So I actually don't think we're viewing it as an option anymore. It's a tool to facilitate either option 1 or option 2. So it's no longer an option. So it's exactly what you're saying. We may decide to do it, but it's a tool or a temporary step toward 1 or 2. And because of the time, I'm just going to do, we have a closed session at 6. It sounds like we have taken number 3 off the table. Mothballing is now on the side. And what we really want staff to come back with are options 1 and 2. Any objections to that? And this is not a motion, this is a study session. We just need consensus. Vice Mayor.
Mayor, I'd like to suggest that what we ask staff to look at is I'm going to call it a hybrid of 1 and 2, eliminating the possibility of demolishing anything, because I really do not think we can go there in the long term, and that it is fruitless to spend time and energy going there. But to bring back a proposal that, or further information that phases, and I agree, mothballing is a tool, phases this and gives us the pluses and minuses of phasing into a full rehabilitation or stopping short and just rehabilitating the one section that was proposed in option 2 and leaving the wings mothballed for what amounts to an indefinite period of time or until other funding would come to be. So you're kind of looking at, a phased redo the whole thing, or redo the north part, mothball the wings, and what does that do in terms of, costs and all the other things that would be involved?
So I can tell you where I am, Vice Mayor, and I appreciate the hybrid suggestion. I am still interested in staff coming back with a true option 2 where there is partial demolition and what that involves and what that looks like, and really more information on what we need to do in order to carry that out. Because of the reasons I've said before, where instead of having a full-blown structure, regardless if it's 2 years or 10 years from now, I actually think there are concerns related to having the full-blown structure, as I've articulated before. And so I am not there yet for this study session where I'm willing to support number 1, because that's what you're saying, even though it's referred to as a hybrid, it's just prolonging the wings and when we rehabilitate those. So I still feel strongly about when staff comes back, they include the partial demolition option 2. And not.
But do I understand that a partial demolition would in fact invalidate the historic nature of the entire structure? Because I believe that to me, that's the problem with partial demolition, is that it does mean that the remaining piece, that north face, would no longer qualify as an historic structure. And
so remember, Vice Mayor, that's the question I asked, because I wanted to make sure I said, can we preserve the historic integrity and elements if we went with number 2?
And the answer is no, you can't.
Let me go to staff, because I thought it was that would be the partial rehabilitation of those elements. But let's make sure we understand if under option 2, there's still a way to preserve the historical integrity and elements without necessarily having the full-blown structure.
And for that, I'm going to go to Page and Turnbull for that, Christina or Barrett.
Yeah, I think I can take this one. So as the project moves forward, you would be coming to us with a proposed project that we would be analyzing with the Secretary of the Interior standards. And looking at the current option laid out as option 2, where you're only retaining the north wing, that's only a third of the existing historic resource. So I think I would have to defer to city on whether it would still be a city historic resource at that point, or it wouldn't be a city historic landmark, since it would have lost over 50% of its material integrity. However, we could look at a number of options that include partial demolition and which elements are remaining and which are being removed to balance a standards compliant project. I can't say whether that's only retaining the north wing or whether that's retaining the north and the east wing, or elements of those and inserting kind of a new interior into some of those historic features. That is something we would have to come at once we have a project in front of us.
Thank you, Ms. Reiner. Councilmember Meadows.
Is the 50% rule a city rule, or is that a Secretary of Interior rule?
That's in the city guidelines, that it's 50% of the material integrity, the age requirement, and then meeting a criteria of significance.
So that's not in the Secretary of Interior or any
No.
or in the state rules. Thank you.
Thanks, Vice Mayor. Councilmember Meadows.
Yeah, so the one last point I want to make, I do think that mothballing is a tool, but we should, given all the priorities that we have and all the time the staff doesn't have to deal with everything, that we should have staff consider whether they bring, you know, as these, as you flesh out the options 1 and 2 as discussed, there might be, we might want to consider mothballing for a year because we've prioritized XYZ, or mothballing for 2 years, you know, a short term before we begin a total or a partial, because I think we've had this discussion in absence of priorities. And so we should at least, everything we've talked about involves mothballing or preserving as best we can what we've got right now. So therefore, let's look at what that is, and can we phase this in such a way that it's mothballed until we maybe do other projects that are prioritized. But we're not kicking the can down the road. We have an actual plan to do that. So that's what I would use mothballing as a tool to buy some time for prioritization.
Thank you, Councilmember Meadows. So I'm going to go to Councilmember Liang, Councilmember Weinberg, and then we will close. And I think, and then Mr. England, I will come back to you after Councilmember Weinberg, just for you to confirm that the direction is clear before we close the study session. So Councilmember Liang.
Thank you. When it does come back, I would not feel comfortable as it coming on as a discussion item. I think it needs to be another study session. I think that as a study session, it would be able to allow us to give better direction into what we all truly want. So that is what I'm asking, that when it comes back again, it comes back as a study session. Thank you.
Thanks, Councilmember Liang. I think that's a good suggestion. Councilmember Weinberg.
I think we are not going down the right road here, and it's for financial reasons. I understand the litigation concerns. I don't understand why they haven't been brought up other places, but I understand them here. But we are talking about spending $3, $4, $5, $6 million on the Halsey House, which I will go so far as to say is not the city's most important resource. I think that this is not a project that the voters of Los Altos would want us to spend this much money. I'm a little surprised that my colleagues aren't as kind of shocked as I am that staff says it's no problem, we've got the money for this, when half a year ago we were told the CIP budget is going to zero in a couple of years. But no, we've got plenty of money to do this. If we're really talking about spending this kind of money, and in Los Altos, you talked about $1 million here, $1 million there. That is real money. I think we have an obligation then to take it to the voters, whether it be by a referendum or a bond. Why don't we find out on this issue, because it is so expensive, and because we have been told that financially we have so many other concerns. Let's find out if this really is a project that the voters want us to spend this much time, money, and other resources on.
Mayor, may I briefly clarify the budget question? Just so council is clear, we're not appearing to casually state the finding or funding this would be an easy task. What we are trying to say is if council wants us to move forward, we will identify potential funding sources that include potentially using reserves, funding sources we haven't used before, general fund, potentially rebalancing or delaying approved capital projects. So this in no way is an easy lift, but I want to make clear that if council moves forward with that option, we will bring forward a funding plan. What that looks like may not be something that council ultimately determines is palatable with the trade-offs. But I don't want it to appear that we found the money and it's easy to bring forward.
City Attorney, go ahead. You're muted.
While you're giving direction, and we may be coming back to a study session, I know there was mentioned that the legal risks have not been explained adequately. Can anyone add to that? Because I know I have, there is a, an attorney-client memo, and is there more legal research that the council would like?
So I know Councilmember Meadows had mentioned that. Councilmember Meadows, do you have any outstanding legal questions for Ms. Houston to follow up on?
Well, I mean, I'm going to ask the question. It's not something I'm advocating because I don't like this approach. So if we just took all right, let's demolish it approach, or even whatever the other option is in theory, number 2, where we have all this, and we just basically didn't do things the right way. And again, I'm not advocating this. I'm looking at this as a worst case scenario. Does the order, and yes, we have to pay their attorney's costs and we have to spend the time on the litigation ourselves and all that. But is that still a less expensive option than the $3+ million for option 2? Well, or even less than the total rehabilitation of $4.5+ million.
Wow, okay. And then I think Councilmember Lee Ng had mentioned something about the legal risk.
Yeah, you normally give us percentages on where we stand, what the risk is, what the chances are. You can provide that as well.
I usually don't give percentages, but I will try to, because that's really hard to gauge, but I can, I can give you worst case scenarios, and I'll try to get a dollar amount on the worst case scenario. And yeah, but you would want like the percentage of risk or loss or success or something. Okay.
Thank you. Okay, so Mr. England, Vice Mayor, I said I was going to have Councilmember Weinberg have the last word. It's 5:52. Is your point something that needs to be made at this session? Go ahead.
I think we need to say something about the floodplain situation and whether and to what extent we want that looked at. I've spent my whole life looking at water resources in this valley, and I agree with what Mr. Golden said. At some point, if we are going to go forward, we probably need to redo the survey so that we know where this really is. But I do not see this as a very high risk situation, based on having been down at that creek and looking at that every storm we've had, any big storm we've had for the last 43 years. So I think we need to be sure what we are or aren't going to do in further investigating that. And I don't see that as a big thing to investigate for the next stage, other than we probably need to plan a survey at some point.
Thank you. Mr. England, is our direction clear for the next? And I agree with Councilmember Liang. I think having a study session to further flesh this out would be helpful, as opposed to going straight to a regular council meeting. So any questions for us? Is our direction clear on what we want staff to come back with?
Yes, Mayor. We will bring back further discussion on options 1, 2, and 4, including using option 4 as a tool. Remove option number 3, and it will be at a study session.
Great. All right. So with that, I will adjourn our study session at 5:53 p.m. Thank you, everybody.